Welcome to the Wednesday SSP seminar. I'm Taylor Fravel. A little less hair, a little browner. Taylor couldn't be here today, so I'm delighted to host it. For those of you who don't know, I'm Vipin Narang here at SSP, and I'm delighted today to invite Lisa Langdon Koch to speak to us. She's one of the best up-and-coming, now tenured nuclear scholars. I was at her first book workshop before the pandemic, and then the pandemic happened and time flies. In the meantime, the book Nuclear Decisions, Changing the Course of Nuclear Weapons Programs, Oxford University Press, not only came out, it won the Robert Jervis Best Book in International Security Award, and she's going to present today. She's visiting from Claremont McKenna, so warmer climes, but she went to college down the street at Boston College, and then even colder, did her PhD at Michigan. She was a Harry Truman Scholar. She has been the recipient of a Stanton Nuclear Security Grant, and also funded by the Carnegie Corporation, our friends in New York. Today, she's going to speak on her early stages of her second book project on nuclear threats. And we are delighted to have you here, Lisa. Thanks. And the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for having me out here. As Vipin said, I did my undergrad at BC. So it's really nice to be back in the Boston area. And I even, on the very short walk over from the hotel, there were a few tiny little snowflakes floating down. And since I now live in Southern California, it was exotic and exciting. So thank you for delivering that. I'm glad I'm leaving before your storm comes in. So I wish you well with all of that, but you're used to that by now for sure. So as Vipin said, I'm presenting what's going to be what is my second book project, what hopefully will become the second book. And what I'm doing right now is I'm presenting to you some of the logic. I'm presenting to you what is motivating this project, and I'm going to give you a sense of where it's headed. What I would love this is a wonderful time for me to be presenting. What I would love in the Q&A is to get feedback from you all, to get criticism from you all, and that's really going to help me shape this project going forward. So this is the perfect group, really, to workshop this early work with. And I really want to thank all of you for being here. So the questions that I want to ask in this project are the following. First, I'm interested in the 21st century nuclear context. And I'm wondering whether a new threat context, a new nuclear threat context has emerged. And I'll describe what I mean by that. Secondly, I would like to know how US decision makers and officials understand state-issued nuclear threats, and I'll talk about what do I mean by state-issued nuclear threats, and how do they respond to them in this, what I'm going to argue as a new nuclear threat context. And so what that means for the book project is, in addition to theoretical logic, I want to know not just how are we all as scholars, and many of you are scholars and practitioners, but not just how are we as scholars theorizing this, how are the practitioners perceiving this? And the implications for the project include implications for how we understand nuclear deterrence today. Does a new nuclear threat environment, if I succeed in making the case that we're in one, does that have implications for nuclear deterrence or does it not? What are the implications for crisis management? Once we understand more about how US decision makers, so I'm looking at the American context, I'll leave it to others to examine other contexts. Crisis management in the US case, how does understanding perceptions and responses in an operational environment give us information about crisis management going forward and making that better? And there are implications for this in this project for policy regarding the size, composition, and deployment of the US nuclear arsenal. And I'm going to talk in particular about non-strategic nuclear weapons. So here's how the talk will proceed. First, I'm going to talk about this idea. I am not the first person to put this idea forward, but I'll talk about my understanding about why we're in a new nuclear threat context. I'll talk about what I mean by nuclear threats and whether we should write them off as meaningless. And then I'm going to briefly present some early, a little bit of case study, a little bit of early information about how US officials perceived threats in two contexts: the North Korean nuclear threats and American nuclear threats of 2017 and 18, and Russia's nuclear threats in 2022 in particular, but going through 2024. I won't do all of that, of course, in this talk. We have more information right now about the 2017-2018 series of events because of the books that have been published. We have much less in terms of 2022, but I expect now that we're in a new administration, it won't be too long before some books start coming out. But in addition to what we can learn from the books, which one always approaches with a little bit of healthy skepticism, in addition to what we can learn from the books, I'm also conducting interviews of US officials so that and I'm doing that across roles and ranks, so that I can get a better and clearer understanding of what were the conversations like when these events were unfolding, to plug better into what were the perceptions like, and were any of the things that I'm going to identify as characteristics of the new environment, were they indeed coming into play in these conversations? So we'll find out. I don't have the findings yet. It's in progress. So has a new nuclear threat environment emerged, or threat context emerged in the 21st century? There are several different factors, and many have identified them. These are ones that I think are particularly important that could shape the nuclear threat context. Artificial intelligence is entering what is essentially a new period in its emergence, and it's being integrated into NC3 systems, really, and at levels that I don't have enough information to be able to speak authoritatively about because this is classified. Introducing artificial intelligence into the nuclear threat environment also introduces more uncertainty and more doubt. It introduces more risk. What if the data has been tampered with? What if there's data poisoning that artificial intelligence is using or being trained on? Autonomous systems. Is the battlefield being more and more cluttered? New systems to identify and to understand how they operate. New types of mistakes that might get made. How does one interpret what is happening and what to do about it? If drones attack Moscow, what should the response be? Space. New possibilities for weaponization. New possibilities for interfering with detection, with signals. There is so much reliance on systems in space when it comes to warning of nuclear attack. Exotic delivery systems. This is what always captures the attention of the media. It captures the attention of Congress. It captures the attention of my students. And so I expect it also captures the attention of policymakers and decision makers in the United States. And that some of these exotic delivery systems, like hypersonic glide vehicles, are less predictable, raise more doubts, feel riskier, feel scarier. Cyber attacks. Hacking. Left of launch scenarios. All of these things have been present for a long time, but in the 21st century, this has become a heightened operational risk. New and emerging nuclear armed states. The one I'll talk about is North Korea, which emerges as a nuclear armed state in the 21st century. But the possibility of Iran emerging as a nuclear armed state, for example. There is uncertainty in the current nuclear threat environment as to not only what states might emerge, but also what actions is one taking today, the United States say, what actions could the United States take today that might inadvertently incentivize a potential proliferator to decide that they also need a nuclear arsenal. Non-strategic nuclear weapons. I'm going to talk a little bit later about the resurgent interest in the last couple of decades and why non-strategic nuclear weapons might be disruptive in the nuclear threat environment and threat context, especially in terms of perception. And I'll talk about that in the Russian context in 2022. And the media environment. We know news travels very fast. We know it's very confusing. We know that the technology of the media environment today allows deepfake videos, allows for the promulgation of disinformation at speeds and levels that are new and that we're still grappling with, because determining what is real and what is not is so much harder than it used to be. Consumers of information have limited response time and limited ability to evaluate sources. And that means not only us, not only my students who come to class routinely and say, I heard that X happened, and I say, that doesn't sound right. But also people who are making decisions are getting that information as well and are coming in and trying to understand. My intelligence community is telling me this, but also there's live video from this location that's telling me something else. How do I weigh all of these news sources as well? And these are the three that I'm going to be referencing today in the talk, that I'm going to be looking at to say, are these three factors of the new nuclear context, do I see them coming into play in the North Korean threat environment and in the Russian threat environment? So I'm looking at nuclear threats, and I'm thinking about nuclear threats in the classic way. I'm thinking about nuclear threats in terms of state-issued verbal or written threats, but I'm also thinking about the signaling. It can be argued that nuclear threats are meaningless. Nuclear threats might just be cheap talk. Anyone can say anything. It's bluster. It's a bluff. It's meant to throw you off. They should be ignored. It could be that nuclear threats don't achieve the desired outcomes. And Todd Sesher and Matt Furman's really good book is a great look at why it appears that nuclear threats do not, nuclear compellent threats don't work. They don't achieve the desired outcome. So in that case, why would we care much about nuclear threats if they don't work? It could be that if the issuer of the threat is issuing it to a target that also has a nuclear arsenal, the mutual vulnerability renders the threat inert. It defangs the threat. If we're mutually vulnerable, how is your threat credible? But it's possible that they are meaningful in different ways. They might just be cheap talk, but back to Fearon, what if threats are accompanied by costly signals? If the issuer backs up the threat, the verbal threat, with an action that involves some kind of cost, it raises the risk in some way. It triggers audiences. Or if the issuer issues a threat that is purely action, a missile test. That's a costlier signal that I could use, that I could find more information in potentially as I'm seeking information in this new threat environment in which I have more uncertainty and doubt than ever before. It is possible that the receivers of the threats do view verbal threats and written threats as informative. So the scholars in the room, immersed in the bargaining model of war, are thinking, you have to have the costly signal, you have to enter into the game of brinkmanship, otherwise it's just cheap talk. How can you tell the threatener's type? How can you tell whether they are resolute and they really mean it, they're willing to execute the threat, or if they're irresolute and the threat is empty? How can you tell? We know that that's the theory. What about people in the room who are making the decision? What about people in Washington who are highly educated, but perhaps not steeped in Fearon and Morrow, right? Is that how they're thinking about it? Or are they casting about in this new nuclear threat environment, full of uncertainty and doubt, looking for data wherever they can get it? And this is data. Verbal or written threats are data points. Are those informative, at least in the background, shaping their general impression of hostility, of aggression, of likelihood of an actual military operation? Are they actually looking deeper to try to understand? There's been a baseline threat level that was here, and now that threat has gone up. The threat got more specific today. The threat got angrier today. Something has changed. I think that's informative, even if you think the threat is bluster. What about, to quote Schelling, the threat that leaves something to chance? And this is perhaps one of the strongest cases for why nuclear threats would be meaningful, because if it is not credible that I would actually carry out the nuclear threat, what if I take some steps toward the brink, and now there's a chance in those vivid images that Schelling gives us, now there's a chance that something could happen. I could slip because I don't know where the next step is. A rock tumbles down the cliff and knocks me out, and I take you with me. The fear can fill in the credibility gap. And I'm going to give you this quotation from Khrushchev, because I think it illustrates really well the idea that if assured destruction makes nuclear weapons use unthinkable, or I'll say mutual vulnerability makes nuclear weapons use unthinkable, then there would be no fear at all, and the deterrence would be meaningless. And here's what Khrushchev has to say to us. When I learned all the facts about nuclear power, I couldn't sleep for several days. There's the fear. He's terrified. Then I became convinced that we could never possibly use these weapons, and I was able to sleep again. He realizes the fear will prevent everybody from ever using them. But all the same, we must be prepared. So the fear has not reduced the possibility to zero. He realizes it's irrational for anyone to use them, but it is possible, and so we must be prepared. And that, I think, can be applied to why nuclear threats can still be meaningful, even in a world where it doesn't seem credible that someone will execute the threat. How about the problem that nuclear threats don't usually achieve desired outcomes? I wonder, what if they do shape outcomes? So Sasher and Furman, and their book is terrific. If there are grad students who haven't read it, I highly recommend it. They are looking at, does the threatener achieve the desired goal? But I wonder, what is the desired goal? I don't know. I put the target's ideal point, but I meant the issuer's ideal point. I don't know what the threatener wants. I know when I negotiate, I'm not going to offer the price that I actually am willing to pay, right? I am going to offer something that's a little bit lower. Or if I'm trying to sell something, I'm going to ask for a number that's a little bit higher. I can't observe the ideal point. So just because the threatener didn't get exactly what they wanted as they stated it in the threat, doesn't mean they didn't get what they wanted. They might have wanted something else that I could not observe, and maybe they got it. What about the idea that mutual vulnerability will defang the nuclear threats? Okay, but what if a leader thinks he could fight a limited nuclear war? And this is going to get back to the non-strategic nuclear weapons aspect of the environment that I see coming into play in a new way in the last several years. What if a leader thinks he could keep the war limited? Can we escape the problems that come from assured destruction, from mutual vulnerability? Back to Schelling again. What if existing in that condition of mutual vulnerability makes people jumpy? And that's his word, and I love it. That's the fear again. How will people act in the high pressure situation where there is a real fear that the adversary might actually make the move to cross the threshold? Let's say it's to use nuclear weapons in a tactical setting at what we would think of relatively as a low level, although James Mattis said there is no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Any use of nuclear weapons at any time is a strategic game changer. But let's say somebody wants to try it. And there's the real risk that it could happen. Now we enter Schelling's world, and he writes about this in Arms and Influence. He writes about this in Strategy of Conflict. Emotions are a part of our humanity. Decision makers are human. When people get scared, they might make different decisions. What if they can't think coolly and rationally the way we theorize they should? And in a nuclear threat environment that feels more dangerous, feels more uncertain, and feels more risky, will people keep cool heads and think about the right things as we would think about the right things? And so I care about US officials' perceptions. It is the perception of the threat that is going to matter for the people who are making the decisions about how to respond. And not responding is also a response. So for how to respond. They are operating in a condition of uncertainty in which they are seeking information. They are seeking data. And I think all the way back to the example of Yuri Andropov in the Soviet Union using a computer model in which data was input into this computer model that quantified different elements of the rivalry between the Soviet Union and United States, and it would produce a number. And if the number passed a certain threshold, the idea was the United States might strike first with nuclear weapons. The United States might conduct an attack against the Soviet Union. And he paid attention to it, we know, at some level, maybe just at the margins, he paid attention to it. But it contributed to his sense of paranoia leading into the 1983 war scare that I know many of you are very familiar with. So maybe only at the margins this will matter, but decisions get made at the margins. And I've already spoken about the high pressure context that we would expect might change the way people would normally react. And I'll quote Jervis here, one of my favorite books. He wrote Hypothesis 9, as he offers his hypotheses on perception and misperception, states that actors tend to see the behavior of others as more centralized, disciplined, and coordinated than it is. And he offers this hypothesis to us to say, when one is perceiving and I'll say a threat, but an action from another state. So I'll say a threat from an adversary. One tends to think this is a message that is centralized, disciplined, and coordinated. Everyone on the other side thinks this. This is a unified signal. It may not be so. I bet if you asked practitioners in the United States, is that the process by which the United States sends messages? They would laugh you out of the room and say, absolutely not. You should see the discussions that we have. And yet, do they tend to still, even knowing that, do they tend to view signals from other states as multidimensional, as the product of debate, or not? And that, of course, is going to depend on regime type and context and all of those things. But I think that this is an important part of perception as well. We can observe and we can guess, but we could be wrong. And it's a lesson for me. I can see what happened, and I'll give you some timelines. I can see what happened in the timeline. I can see A came before B. I don't want to therefore assume that A caused B. I also don't want to assume that because I know the end of the story, I also know how we got there. And so that's why I need to conduct interviews to find out what were the conversations and how did we get from A to B. So starting with the North Korea US nuclear threat context of 2017 that continued into 2018, I will give you a couple highlights of that time in a minute. But first, what was the nuclear threat context at the time? Some of this was just a continuing context, such as the regime type. Kim Jong-un leads North Korea, has led North Korea for years by that point, the third in line in a family regime. That hasn't changed. Insecurity, the general state of insecurity that North Korea, that Kim and the government experienced, that would not have been any different at that time. North Korea's use of state media to issue threats and propaganda, that was ongoing and was not different at that time. What was new in 2017? North Korea was a relatively newly nuclear capable and then nuclear armed state. And only 11 years, really less, 10 and a half at the point where we enter into 2017, 10 and a half years after that initial successful nuclear test, there was still an enormous amount of uncertainty regarding exactly how capable was North Korea of delivering weapons, how accurate were delivery systems, could they which warheads could be miniaturized, where could they strike? All of this was still uncertain. And most uncertain of all, because there was no information about it, was how does a nuclear-armed North Korea capable of striking the homeland of the United States, how does that North Korea behave? Nobody knew, because that North Korea didn't exist yet. It's going to exist in a minute on this timeline, but it didn't exist. So no one had past experience to be able to understand how North Korea might behave in that situation. In fact, they were trying to gather data about it in real time. Another new aspect, 2017, and I'll show you when, is when North Korea developed an intercontinental ballistic missile capability that would be able to strike either part of the US homeland, then most to all of the US homeland with different degrees of accuracy. Another aspect of this new environment is the media environment. North Korea, as I said before, used state media to issue threats, but now we're in a new media environment with access to social media and ways to spread a message beyond if somebody knows how to log on to one of the North Korea watch sites that translates into English and archives for you the missives coming out of the state. So here are some key moments during this time that give us the context for then what unfolds. By fall of 2016, North Korea has achieved a capability to reach South Korea and most of Japan with 15 to 20 kiloton bombs. So that is a new capability. March 2017, it's estimated that that's the point at which North Korea would have achieved the capability to overwhelm theater missile defenses. Summer is the possible capability to reach much of the continental United States. By the fall is what our scientists believe to be the first successful hydrogen bomb test, going from atomic bombs now to thermonuclear bombs. When Donald Trump took office in January of that year, not long after, he launched the maximum pressure campaign in North Korea, one of several maximum pressure campaigns. This is the North Korean campaign, and that involved tough statements, that involved more sanctions, and it involved signals. And the US Air Base in Guam was the source of the physical military signals being sent, which is why then later Kim Jong-un references Guam when his threats get more specific. In May and July, North Korea has several successful missile tests demonstrating that they do have this new capability. The United States responds with carefully designed missile test messages. For example, launching an Army tactical missile into the East Sea that travels exactly 186 miles, because 186 miles was the exact distance from the launch location to where Kim was overseeing missile tests, to the tent where he was sitting overseeing the missile tests. And so that was a clear signal, so the United States thought, of we can reach you exactly where you are. That is how much we know, and that is how accurate we can be. However, it was reported that the North Korean government did not receive that signal as intended, that based on intelligence reports, this was not, even though this seemed like the clearest message to send, it was not interpreted that way in North Korea. They missed the message. So that's interesting, because here's the US sending clear as day messages with missiles that aren't being perceived correctly. Yet the United States is interpreting North Korean missile tests as clear as day signals without really any concern that they might be misinterpreting North Korea's missile tests at all. Ongoing threats are being published by state media. Then we come in this, so this gives us the context then for the famous exchange of threats. Donald Trump issues the fire and fury remarks to the press in August, and his staff reported that this was after weeks of being very, very angry and making these kinds of comments privately, but in particular after the July ICBM tests. The same day, a few hours later, the North Korean regime responds, and this threat is different because it's highly specific. It's targeting, the threat says Guam is the target, and uses the phrase enveloping fire. And everyone understands these euphemisms, fire and fury, like the world has never seen, enveloping fire. Everyone understands these are euphemisms and veiled threats related to nuclear attacks. How do you discern the signaling from the noise? There's so much data. There's so much uncertainty. North Korea is issuing all kinds of threats all the time. How can you tell what to pay attention to and what not to pay attention to? On August 29th, North Korean missile tests are conducted over Japan. And this shakes everybody up, not only the Japanese, but also American officials who are watching this happen in real time and wondering, what if there is an accident? What if there was a miscalculation? What if this missile strikes Japan instead? What would we do? What would the response be? And at this point, the president has delegated down authority to his Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, and said, if you think you need to use intercepts to knock one of these missiles down, go ahead and do it. And Mattis is thinking, I have no guidance from, he reports this to Bob Woodward, he's got no guidance from the president. And he expects that if he does that, if he knocks something out of the sky, a missile out of the sky with intercepts, if it works, let's say it works, he expects Kim's going to send more. And he doesn't know what happens next. Nobody knows what the nuclear battlefield looks like. The Security Council condemns the tests. Trump says all options are on the table, a veiled nuclear threat. Then the nuclear test comes a few days later. 2 weeks after that, the next North Korean missile test that again goes over Japan has a flight range capable of striking the US Air Base in Guam. 4 days later, Donald Trump gives his speech to the General Assembly in which he threatens to totally destroy North Korea. And then Kim responds, I will surely indefinitely tame the mentally deranged US dotard with fire, widely reported. And we can laugh now, right? Because we know, I know, yeah, right? No, I'm sure if you saw the metrics, it would be great. And we can laugh about it now because we know how the story ends. We know the story ends. We know that in December of that year, overtures are made to bring Kim and Trump together for talks. We know that they meet 3 times in the next 2 years. We know that none of this fire and fury happens. So we can laugh about it now. At the time, people were not laughing. At the time, what we know right now, just from what's been published in memoirs and in books, we know that they were taking this very, very seriously. So for example, the number one takeaway was our policies aren't working. Maximum pressure isn't working. The North Koreans aren't seeing what we want them to see, and they're not feeling what we want them to feel. And Tillerson said North Korea is out of control. There was this very strong feeling among the decision makers that they had lost control of the situation. I don't know if they ever had it, but they thought they had it, and now they felt they lost it. So that's a perception that could be a dangerous sensation, a dangerous feeling. Mattis talks about how he was trying to prioritize reason over impulse. He was worried that in this scenario of escalating threats, that even though he thought the threats were bluster, and he described the threats as childish and silly, he also described them as dangerous, that this was contributing to a threat and risk environment that could lead to a chain of events that would be out of his control. There was the feeling among many in the administration that war may not be able to be prevented. And I'm not naming anybody right now without permission, but one official I spoke to who's not on this list put it to me this way and said, I was trying my best to prevent a war, but I didn't think I was going to succeed. That was the feeling. We can laugh now, but that was the sense at the time. The NSA, General McMaster said that he believed that the missile tests were not just signals, they were offensive exercises, preparing the regime for either an offensive nuclear strike or to enable them to provide them cover to be able to expel the United States from the Korean Peninsula. nuclear war was possible in people's minds. I already mentioned how Mattis was worried what would happen if he had to order the interception, that it wouldn't end there. He was worried about miscalculation or malfunction. He referenced July 1914 and said, I could see that we were in the same kind of situation that dragged the great European powers into World War I. I am looking at the clock, and I'm seeing that I'm not going to have time to cover this part of it. So here's what I'm going to do. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for Q&A and that you have plenty of time to give me feedback. Let me just do this. Let me give you a couple of like wrap-up thoughts on the North Korean case. And then I will leave it there, but I'll show you just one chart before I wrap up. So the takeaways for me from the North Korean case are that the threat environment was affected by the newness of the situation. The expression that things are out of control, we've lost control, meaning things used to be in control. Things are not. The new capabilities mean things are out of control, but also the recklessness, the perceived recklessness with which Kim is wielding these capabilities means that we have lost control of the situation. This is not someone who is behaving the way we expect a nuclear-armed state's leader to behave. And they are gathering the data in real time. They have no previous experience because it's only just now that North Korea has developed capabilities that threaten not just US interests, but the United States territory itself, the continental, the homeland. So in that environment, the issued threats form part of the background. It's like a quilt. It's part of the background that now everyone is operating in to try to interpret what do these signals mean. And when you have folks in the room like McMaster, very well read, PhD in history, and he cites in his book, he cites some of the articles that he was reading at the time. Like he was reading Jeffrey Lewis, and he's saying Lewis thinks that there's an offensive threat, that North Korea is planning a nuclear attack. And here's why he thinks it's true, and here's why I think it's true. So in this kind of unfolding real-time environment, the fact that this is a new nuclear capable, we'll say, state, I think is an important factor. So yeah,
take a little bit of time.
You think 5 minutes?
Yeah.
I don't want to. Okay. Let me, we're okay. All right. I don't want to do that thing where, like, I always tell my students, like, don't do that thing where you talk and never stop. So I love it. All right. Okay. So I'll continue to filibuster. That sounds great. And then we'll get to it. All right. So what do I see as the continuing nuclear threat context versus the new nuclear threat context when I'm looking at the Russia scenario? So continuing, Russia possesses a large and diversified nuclear arsenal. That's no different at that time. Russia is conducting influence operations to manipulate the adversary, to confuse the United States, what's real, what's not, what do we mean, what do we not, so that they can then, as I heard Dima Adamski say once, so that they can move the United States toward their aims. That's all ongoing. What's new? What's part of the new nuclear threat environment? What's new is an increased, let's say, interest in non-strategic nuclear weapons. And I'm going to keep using the term non-strategic nuclear weapons. And what I mean is, because we have a lot of terms that are a little bit vaguely defined, what I mean is nuclear weapons that would be used on the battlefield rather than sent to an enemy's homeland. And what I'm also going to mean by that is low-yield nuclear weapons. And I'll show you a chart in a minute about where I see that shift happening. The new context of exotic delivery systems. And Putin, as we all remember, makes a really big deal about this. And he has PowerPoint presentations and 3-hour-long speeches and everything about how awesome his new exotic delivery systems are, because they promise to be able to outmaneuver US missile defenses, for example. which I don't think he needs to worry about. But if one were to be worried, this would be one way to try to outmaneuver. And because I think there are a lot of reasons he's interested in them. But I think another reason is, besides showing the prowess, the technological strength of Russia, they also are scary. They get a lot of media attention. Anytime anybody writes about them, it sounds like they're writing about the universe of Star Wars or something like that. Congressional hearings get held. Experts get brought in to explain exactly what are these things and how are they different. They, again, raise risk because they raise uncertainty and they inspire doubt. Influence operations were already ongoing, but they expand during this time period. There are more, better, faster ways of spreading disinformation in this context. Here's the chart I promised I would show you. This chart, the x-axis is years. So it starts at the end of the Cold War. Prior to that, we would need the y-axis. It would be maybe just 3,000 more than it is. It goes up to 22,000 non-strategic nuclear warheads. In the 1950s and 1960s, this was like the heyday of non-strategic nuclear weapons. Like, how could we use them? Could we use them in different theaters? Can we use them to achieve limited aims? In the 1970s, the interest falls for multiple reasons. If we use one, it will harm our own troops. It'll hurt our allies' troops. Delegating down command and control to the battlefield is too risky. How do we ensure that the war doesn't happen without meaning to? Conventional weapons capabilities had improved by then also, to the extent where there was less of a military use for these tactical nuclear weapons. And the fact that there were dual capable systems and introduced ambiguity into the environment, where you can't tell if what I just fired, what I just brought out onto the battlefield, I'm ready to launch something, you don't know if it's nuclear or conventional, because this is a dual capable system. And so for all of these reasons, we had in the 1970s and the 1980s, there was decreased interest, certainly in the United States. And you start to see those lines slope for Russia as well. But then 1991 and 92 are George H.W. Bush's presidential initiatives. The United States unilaterally goes first and says, we will withdraw or eliminate our tactical nuclear weapons. Gorbachev says we'll do something similar. The Russia rather, never does it to the extent that the United States does it. But today, the United States has roughly 100 B-61 bombs in Europe, and roughly 100 in the stockpile in the United States. Russia, the estimate is 1 to 2,000. And Russia's interest in non-strategic nuclear weapons has been increasing. At the same time, the United States' interest, and they're not going to show up on this chart, but the United States' interest in either non-strategic nuclear weapons that would show up on this chart, like B-61 bombs, which are variable yield bombs, dial a yield. You can choose how explosive you want them to be, how destructive. But also low-yield nuclear weapons like the W-76-2 on SSBNs. So also U.S. interest in, okay, if this seems to be the direction that we're going, and credibility depends on lower yield options, because nobody believes that we're going to start the apocalypse by attacking cities with 300 kiloton weapons, with 1 megaton weapons. Nobody believes that. So we have to go lower yield for more credibility. As both sides are investing, that starts to change the nuclear threat environment, because at the core, nuclear war becomes more possible. It has never been not possible. That's what Khrushchev is telling us. It has never been not possible, but it starts to become more possible. I already talked about that. And so what I want to get to then, I'm just going to show you this as the context for what I want to talk about that happens in October of 2022. So since the February 22nd, 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, since that day, Putin and others in his circle issue threats using euphemisms for nuclear weapons and nuclear war directed at NATO, saying don't get involved. The most important, arguably, signal that then gets sent is Russia forward deploying non-strategic nuclear weapons in Belarus. And questions emerge about how secure are these? Who has control? Moscow is quick to say we have control, but these are the doubts and uncertainties that then start to creep in. Do you really? How good is it? Do you have keypads like the United States has on B-61s or not? And the question always that comes up of, is the Russian nuclear strategy now escalate to de-escalate, meaning would Russia use a tactical, a low-yield nuclear weapon in a battlefield context in order to scare everybody else off and end a war or battle in their favor? Is this truly doctrine or not? And there is a robust argument about whether it is or not, but many believe it is. And I am interested in talking to people who were present during this time to say, did you think it was? Was this something that was in the back of your mind that you thought this is the plan, which makes non-strategic nuclear weapons use all the more likely? So in October, information comes out from the US intelligence community that senior Russian military leaders are having serious conversations about tactical nuclear weapons use, not just vaguely, but in terms of scenarios. They're discussing scenarios. And this, we already have the context of the multiple verbal threats. We have the Biden administration and NATO partners taking incremental steps regarding Ukraine. If we do this much, let's wait and see what will happen. What will Russia do? Okay, that was okay. Let's take another step. What if we do this much? What will Russia do? Okay, that was still okay. The German chancellor calls it boiling the frog. So the old metaphor of you put the frog in the pot of water and you turn up the heat and the frog doesn't notice it's being cooked alive. That was the metaphor that he invoked for this. So I already observe everybody's being very cautious. There's some meaning in these threats. It doesn't have to be, it's enough that Russia has a nuclear arsenal, right? This can just be in the background. Putin never has to open his mouth and you have to worry. But with the threats emanating out of Russia, I have to think that also shapes the data, shapes the information environment that these policymakers are operating in. And they are not nuclear experts for the most part, right? The people making these decisions are not trained. They are reliant on what others are telling them, and they are reliant on their own intuition and their own experiences and their own perceptions. And if they're looking for data points unfolding in real time, threats are an easy way. It's easy to plug into. Anyone can read the threat and think about what they think it means. Not everyone can look at, well, what kind of missile test was it and what was its range and the weight of the payload is going to affect the range. No, they're not thinking like that. But it's easy to read or listen and determine what you think about it. And so when that happens, this is when it, and I'm sure you all remember, this is when people really got scared. This is when the news media was reporting every day, the Biden administration thinks this is going to happen. And this is when top Biden administration officials were taking to the airwaves and issuing public statements about, and Biden himself also being interviewed, about what will happen if Russia actually uses a tactical nuclear weapon on the battlefield. And a very public effort at deterrence and also robust back-channel communications to counterparts in Russia. And that makes it different from the North Korean case because the United States isn't able to have those counterpart discussions the way they are in the Russian case. So last then, what I'll leave you with, and I really will stop talking so that we can have the conversation, is I think it's worth seeing non-strategic nuclear weapons as a disruptor that shapes a new threat environment. Because I think that policymakers, and I'll find out more as I talk to people, do see them as believable, as credible threats that they could be used. It is harder for the United States to observe the preparations for battlefield use than it is to observe preparations for strategic nuclear weapons use. As one US official said, the warning systems are imperfect. I mean, of course they are. All warning systems are imperfect. I've never seen, there's no such thing as a perfect warning system. But there's real concern that signals would be missed. If someone was trying to send signals, we could miss them. There could be insufficient safety measures in place. I alluded to this earlier. How much authority has been delegated down to the battlefield? What are the locks on the weapons? And since it's harder to receive and understand the signals, there's more chaos and confusion in the decision-making environment. And that kind of uncertainty, again, plays right back into the doubt and the fear that can fill in that gap in credibility. And that can also lead to people making decisions in the margins rather than in the cool-headed, rational, quote unquote, way that one would hope they would act. And what do you do finally if the initial strike is a non-strategic nuclear weapons strike? What do you do about that? What's the response supposed to be? And Biden was pressed on this. You know, reporters would ask him, so what exactly would the United States do? And he would say, I'm not going to tell you that. Why would I can't tell you that. I have to leave it somewhat vague. But that is an operational question. And if people are caught off guard because there are no real plans, because these scenarios haven't been gamed out, because no one wants to think about them, then what does that mean in the high pressure environment, decision-making environment as it's unfolding? So thank you so much for your patience. I really look forward to your questions, and just thanks for having me again.
All right, I'll run traffic. Keep your hands up. I saw Caitlin first, but then keep your hands up.
Great, thank you for a really interesting talk. This is a super interesting project, and I particularly commend the interview work. So I guess I have sort of a 30,000-foot question about this book, which is basically, is this a book about how deterrence doesn't work the way it worked in the Cold War, or how it maybe actually does work exactly the way it worked in the Cold War? Because a lot of what you described, like in the DPRK case, in terms of cross signals, crises possibly, spinning out of control, war actually being possible, like we see all those same dynamics in the early U.S.-Soviet crisis and crises in the first half of the Cold War. So maybe this is just like how deterrence works with new nuclear powers. We have new nuclear powers, but basically, like our theories of how this works are still the same, even though we have Twitter now. And like with the Russia case as well, as you point out, there were large arsenals of non-strategic nuclear weapons in the Cold War, and in general, the idea that like the conventionally inferior side is going to try to make nuclear weapons usable and make credible nuclear threats through them, like this is also not new. And so I think it would be helpful at kind of that 30,000-foot level to think about a more specific argument about whether like deterrence is working the way it's worked or it's not. Which would also then enable us to look in these cases and say, yeah, there are things in the contextual environment that are varying, but what should we be looking for to find out if like deterrence or if the dynamics have actually changed? And in some ways, I think it's actually very interesting if despite the changes in the context, actually deterrence is the same as it's always been. Like, I think that could also be very provocative. One just other quick thought that I would
Quick.
Mix is like
Quick.
Yeah.
Quick.
She says she wants to back.
I do.
You're holding Barry up over here.
Is just I do think there's one other really important change in the nuclear environment that actually could change crisis dynamics, and that's a structural change in that we have the presence of multiple independent nuclear competitors, which is very different from the Cold War. And I think that, I've done some writing on how that might actually have distinct effects on crisis behavior. And that to me, I think might be a more powerful variable than some of these other things like, I won't speak to AI, but, social media and, whatever else. So it's just something to flag there if you really are thinking about like, what are all the things in the environment that are different?
That's great. Thank you. And I'll respond very quickly because I saw the hands and I want to hear everyone's feedback. That really my approach is deductive and inductive. So I have reasons to suspect that some of these factors are changing the environment and therefore could be changing the way deterrence is operating, but they could not be. It could be that it is stable at the core level and that is all one needs. And so I am interested, that's why I'm doing the interviews, in order to find out how are people thinking about this. And I agree. When I started the project, I thought no matter what the findings are, it's interesting. So to be determined.
Yeah, I'll abuse and I'll be quick. The position of the chair. No, I will be quick. I do think you have this sort of state or unstated assumption that there's something unique about sort of the 21st century nuclear era, multiple competitors, different sort of deterrence challenges. With Russia, we were trying to deter massive conventional tech. We were going to go first. Now it's sort of flipped. And Russia uses sort of a non-strategic nuclear weapons shield to aggress, and so we are trying to deter Russian first deployment. And we didn't really face an adversary like North Korea, small, but sort of itchy trigger finger, diversifying arsenal. In the Cold War, even China early on didn't look like that. So maybe it is something distinct about sort of the structure, and it's different. And what are you showing us about the structure? I think that would be helpful. What I'm going to do is actually group, because we have so many people. Take 2 questions at a time, 2 questions or comments at a time. Keep them brief. 1 question or comment, not 2, Caitlin. And we'll try and do 2 at a time. So I'm going to do Carol and Paulina together. So Carol, why don't you?
So I have 2 Russia-specific questions.
Right off the bat.
No, both of us, obviously. The first is, what do you do with this phenomenon, sort of the boy who cried wolf? I mean, Putin has threatened, his spokespeople have threatened more than once that, if you do this, we're going to do whatever. And at some point, doesn't that mean that whatever the threat, whatever the signal that was intended actually loses its strength, because he's done it once too often, twice too often. The second question is probably not a fair question. How would you place the new Russian nuclear doctrine in this paradigm that you've laid out of things changing? And what do you think about the escalate to de-escalate? What do you think about the sort of going, emphasizing more for
Play.
The floor is yours, Paulina.
Yeah, my question is a theoretical one. What is nuclear context and what makes it new? Because you presented this list of components, but I cannot say what's the difference between color television and TikTok. So, at a theoretical level, isn't the balance...
One is Chinese intelligence and one is...
Yeah. But at a higher theoretical level, I'm failing at this point to compare and contrast the context of the past and the present, because it exists as a list of components, but not theoretical concept that can be compared and transferable across different eras. So, yeah, what is context?
Great. Okay, so I'll go in order. So as far as, does the signal lose strength and meaning over time because the boy has cried wolf so many times that finally the villagers don't show up when the wolf is actually there? So yes, I do think so. And based on conversations I've had with people, it's not just us who feel like, by the 10th threat, we're all laughing at, it's funny, not funny, but we're all commenting on how empty the threat must be because he hasn't, thank goodness, fulfilled any of the other threats. And the people I've talked to so far have said they felt exactly the same way as this was unfolding, that it was scarier at the beginning. And then what made things scary was the other signals, or in the October case, the intelligence that was being gathered. When I was just talking with my students about this at the time in 2022 and going into 2023, I remember we speculated at some point he'll stop because he won't want to be the laughingstock of the world, because everybody is saying he doesn't mean it. And these are all bluffs and all bluster. And he did. He wound up issuing the statement that I won't be making these threats anymore. And so far, it hasn't at that level at all. And I think that, buys him more leverage if he wants to start issuing them again, because there's been the silence. But absolutely, the past informs how I understand the present, and he showed himself to be incredible. As far as where do I place the new nuclear doctrine in all of this. So I don't know if it is escalate to de-escalate or not. I have talked to Russia experts who have told me very firmly it absolutely is. This is part of the nuclear doctrine. And I have talked to others who have said that is highly questionable. It could be a few analysts and a few military officers who think this, but it is not actually what Russia would do. So I don't know. So let's say if it is the case that this is the strategic thinking, and in that case, I think that is something that changes the nuclear context. I think it changes the nuclear threat environment, and it changes the possible responses from the enemy. But I don't know if they have it or not. And so then this goes into your point. So we have this list I have up of disruptors that many people have come up with more than this. And when people say like everything is changing, it just feels like everything is changing. Why does it feel that way? Well, here are new technologies or new features that make it feel that way. So that's not satisfying at a theoretical level. However, I care about perception, and I care about how practitioners are perceiving their threat environment and then how they're going to respond. And I would argue that the way we're thinking at a theoretical level, that is not the way that they are thinking when they are coming into the room in the crisis. Instead, they have a general background sense of things feel out of control, things feel different. This wasn't the way I was brought up. This isn't the environment that I'm used to. My training didn't prepare me for this. The exercises I participated in the past didn't prepare me for this. So I think like we can go back to the Jervis perception writ large theoretical framework and then say, why would I think that things are happening in this environment that could mean we're in a new environment? Those are some of the things that could be feeding into it. But I think that elements like a return to the use of non-strategic nuclear weapons, that's really going to be what is going to shape the environment in a theoretical and strategic way that takes us away from just a laundry list of things feel out of control. I hope that's somewhat satisfying. Maybe not. We'll think about it more.
Let's go Dan Siebel and Kunal.
Yeah, hi, I'm Daniel Siebel. I'm a third year grad student here. So my question is, you say pretty clearly that you're only looking at verbal and written threats. Why not other sort of signals that can be perceived as threatening? Like, for example, you talk about North Korean missile testing. So North Korean missile nuclear testing in 2017 is really scary. Like, the ICBM's test on July 4th, that's a pretty clear signal. But like the massive North Korean missile testing in 2022 is just like not nearly as much. So like clearly there's something that's not just about the testing, right? But there's something more there. So non-verbal written signals for those. And then just like a recommendation, if you're interested in like perception and strategic warning, I think like Michael Handel has some really interesting work. You know, like I think one quote of his I really enjoy is that, you know, when you think about strategic warning, in effect, all that exists is noise. Signals don't exist. And so I think that's like a real challenge. And so maybe strategic surprise literature as well for some of this research.
Thank you.
Kunal.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. Maybe I'll approach this new context question from a different angle. So you've done these two case studies on North Korea and Russia-Ukraine war. So what part of the evidence that you have got so far does link directly to the new angle? Like, there is some behavioral change, like leaders have behaved in crisis in a certain way, even in the past century. There's some similar behavioral traits visible here. What can be linked to the new aspect, and how do we know that? So,
Okay, great. Thank you. So and Daniel, thank you for the recommendation. That's terrific. So I think the reason why I was giving the timeline was because I wanted to bring us back to 2017, 2018, and remember the whole context of what aggressive moves the United States was making first, how North Korea then appears to be responding, threats that then Donald Trump is making in return, and so on. That this was a two-sided exchange. So in terms of like, what am I going to count as a nuclear threat? Is it just state-issued statements, verbal or written? I think it's really clear that that is important to me. I believe that is an important part of the information environment. But I think it's really clear that what gets everybody's attention is the costly signaling. It's the missile test. That's what's bringing people into the room to watch the monitors and decide what do I do next. And that's when things get real instead of, this is an interesting puzzle. There's a new speech that somebody gave. I wonder what it means. Let's see what the analysts think. We have all week. Like it's a completely different scenario when now there's something like a missile test. So I think your point is really interesting so what about really important missile tests that convey meaningful information, but that don't get picked up and covered in the same way? And so we could therefore observe that and interpret it must not be as threatening. It must not feel as threatening, or at least not to the extent that anyone in DC is phoning up reporters and saying, we've got to get, we've got to get deterrent messages out there in the public to make sure that they hear us. And so we can assume it doesn't feel the same. I haven't thought about the 2022 test, so I'll have to think about that more. But I think then we have to look at context and say, if this was like, if the intelligence community had said, this is a scheduled test, we're expecting it, this is about the right time for them to test this other element of the technology that they're working on, then I can say, okay, so that's not threatening. This is part of scientific discovery and progress. But if it's in the context of an escalating war of words and escalating costly signals, I'm going to interpret it very differently. And so then the perception is everything. Okay, and then, so what evidence is linking into the new angle? So I think that especially, so for the Russia case, for me, is primarily about the non-strategic nuclear weapons. That is, to me, and the idea of, is escalate to de-escalate real or not real? These are two features since, say, like 2018, 2019, that have gotten so much attention in and out of government. I expect that they are shaping the way practitioners are thinking, decision makers are thinking about what Russia is likely to do next. And so I think that is like a qualitatively new aspect of the environment. And the way I've been thinking about it is that takes me from the regular game of chess that I've been playing all during the Cold War, and I've gotten used to that game of chess. It's a terrible and dangerous and frightening game, but I've gotten used to it. And I know what my next moves might be and which ones are the riskier ones and which ones aren't. Now I'm in this world of possibly escalate to de-escalate. I'm in this world of he's put his money where his mouth is, and he's building up exotic delivery systems and non-strategic nuclear weapons again. And so now I'm not on that chessboard anymore. Now I'm playing 4-dimensional chess, and I don't know how to play 4-dimensional chess. I haven't played it. I don't know what the rules are, and I'm not sure what moves I'm supposed to make.
ELG two-finger.
Yes, this is a quick two-finger that maybe bridges Daniel's point and also Canal. So in your response to Canal, it seems like things that go beyond the verbal and written signals actually are mattering a whole bunch, right?
Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you actually broaden your scope conditions to include these nonverbal and non-written signals, right? So
Yeah.
when you speak to policymakers, it might be worth asking them what actually triggers them to view an environment as more threatening. Is it something that's said or written, or is it something that's demonstrated? And I think this actually allows you to tie into some of these kind of new technologies, right, that are being demonstrated. You're actually physically seeing a new widget at work. Potentially that actually shape the threat environment more than just the written and written.
And in a three-finger, we talked
Absolutely.
about this, but October
Yeah.
22, there's no verbal threat, right? It was actually one of the few instances in the 2-year period where there was actually no overt threat from Putin.
And so I guess the other part, right, is to kind of go back and look at Jervis's earlier where he makes the distinction between a signal and an index. And I think a lot of these demonstrations are actually perhaps more as index than a signal.
Thank you. That's great.
Charlie and Barry.
So I would say the nuclear environment itself hasn't changed very much, but the political challenges in the United States have changed in ways that change what's salient in the nuclear environment. And so I don't think there's really I wouldn't say there's especially a new interest in non-strategic weapons, but what we have is we have a major power invading a strategically important neighbor and not doing well in a conventional war. That creates a situation in which it becomes plausible, putting aside stated doctrine and so forth, that you might use a tactical nuclear weapon. And so I would see that it's really that in the Cold War we had, it was this huge standoff. If the war was going to go a certain way, there wasn't really much opportunity to think about limited tactical use, in other words, plan for massive tactical use. This is just a very different but geopolitical situation in which different things matter. And I would argue the same possibility exists with respect to China. So I would sort of look at the different challenges, but not see them as differences in the nuclear environment per se. And we don't have time to get into it, but when you think about like what's different in the nuclear environment, if you think about do we have fundamentally different nuclear capabilities than before? The answer is no. But what's salient matters because the challenges are different. So I think that would be a very different spin. It might not be one you want to take, but it sort of cuts to the core of the issue of nuclear context. But I would, if I was being more argumentative, I would say I will argue that one.
Great, thank you. That's fantastic.
Barry?
Well, you've heard a lot of skepticism about your depiction of the new nuclear environment and have a lot of questions about the implications for the many cases that you've presented. So far, it's not compelling to me that your story is about the new nuclear environment as you've stated it. What is compelling to me is that is the non-strategic nuclear weapons aspect of it. And I would just make the following observation that the role of non-strategic nuclear weapons in the Cold War is one of the most understudied, least understood aspects of both American and Soviet nuclear strategy, right? And so I guess I would encourage you to focus on the non-strategic, also look backwards to the Cold War, and also try and explore some of the differences between our non-strategic nuclear weapons, which are based up against their countries, and their non-strategic nuclear weapons, which are never based up against our countries. So our non-strategic nuclear weapons, in fact, often are strategic nuclear weapons, right? Which is not true of their non-strategic nuclear weapons. So this sets up all kinds of questions and dynamics I think could be usefully explored. In other words, why would we think it is quite credible for the Russians to use tactical nuclear weapons to prevent a conventional disaster in a country to which we have not extended a nuclear guarantee and where we have no forces? The fact is, it is an inherently very credible threat. And I think people should be careful about dismissing it because we do not yet have an answer for how it was the Russians got their people out across the river, out of Kherson. We do not know if that threat effectively worked, if we pulled the Ukrainian choke chain and just said, we don't want to risk it. And had we done this, you can bet that everybody involved would have been sworn to secrecy. Right? So I think that you're on to an important set of issues that we need to know more about across a much longer time span, and that probably is a central element of, or maybe not the, but a central element of what you're calling the new nuclear environment.
Terrific. Thank you so much.
Eric and Eric. We'll do Sam first and then. I was looking at the point in my head.
So I have a nitpicky question that follows directly from Barry's, which
Great.
is the definition you offered of non-strategic nuclear weapons, right, with battlefield use versus homeland use. And I'm not sure that's the way to draw the line between them.
Well, there's a legal definition. I didn't want to three-finger on this, but like it's a treaty definition. And the U.S. government treats the non-New START accountable weapons as non-strategic nuclear weapons. That's it.
Right. But from the issue about making threats, what's a nuclear attack on Guam? Right? That's not a homeland attack, and it's not. Right?
It is. Actually, it is.
It's just not continental.
It is.
Right.
It is a homeland attack. Guam is part of the homeland.
Territory.
The point being,
Navy man.
regardless of what the legal definition is, I'm not sure it's going to help you theoretically. And it might be more about, is this about like a logic of punishment or a logic of denial that's affecting the targeting? That's really the difference there.
Yeah. Can you say that last part again, Eric? It's a logic of punishment or logic of denial.
What we think of traditionally as strategic use is either a logic of punishment or a logic of nuclear counterforce. What we think of as battlefield use is much closer to a logic of denial.
Right.
Denial isn't necessarily only on the battlefield.
That's right.
Eric-ish.
Yeah, so my question is similar to Caitlin's and Kunal's and Charlie's. It's a little bit unclear from the presentation and the slides whether the primary focus was to contest the idea that nuclear threats are not credible, or whether it was to sort of assert that there's a new nuclear environment. So you talked about a nuclear context, and then I was a little surprised to hear 7 of those were sort of technical parameters, and 6 out of 7 of those had to do with strategic systems. So going back to Caitlin's question, I mean, yeah, they're new sort of technologies, but there have been new technologies since the dawn of nuclear weapons, right? New delivery systems, new capabilities, new C3I, all of that, right? So how are the new changes different from the old new changes in terms of their impact? And then I guess what I was expecting to hear was more of the strategic nuclear context and how that might be different. So Caitlin mentioned the multilateral nuclear dynamics and multipolar nuclear dynamics, and multiple major near peer nuclear competitors. I guess the one I would throw out is we have an environment now that differs from the Cold War in that you have major nuclear powers that are non-status quo actors that are not embedded in a status quo bipolar system. So, I think all the issues with deterrence have always been there, but now they're in a structure that seems much more fluid and dangerous.
And I think that is, I think again, that's the key is when you say they're in a structure that seems more fluid and more dangerous is exactly what I'm trying to plug into, is that sense of like, things are different, things are fluid, things are more dangerous.
The technical parameters of nuclear weapons, I mean, we were pretty confident our ICBMs were going to get through. Now we're pretty dang confident that our hypersonics are going to get through. It didn't really change anything, but the political dimensions do seem very different.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, one of the things I've been thinking about with this project too is looking at China and looking at, because if you want to plug into it from the threat, from verbal threats and written threats and signaling, there's plenty there from say like the mid 1990s and then going forward to plug into. And then that situation is a changing strategic context that I can look at between the United States and China. But I think your point's really well taken, and I don't think it's just the technology, because I agree with you. The technology has always evolved, the technology has always changed, and with it come new challenges and new features, and then one adapts. I do think, and I didn't spend any time on this at all in the talk, I do think that it is likely that we will see that introducing artificial intelligence will be a more important technology that changes things in ways that I have not figured out yet. So right now, if we're looking at artificial intelligence, mainly in the use of like command control communications, if we're looking at it in terms of detection, early warning, I think that it is not only going to introduce doubt in the mind of practitioners who are worried that the artificial intelligence is wrong, but I think, or who are worried about relying on it too much. I think right now that might be the concern. As it improves, I could see other concerns being brought up in terms of over-reliance. But I also think that it could explode the dangers and risks that people see right now when we think about hacking, when we think about cyber attacks. I think, again, we're seeing it in like 3 dimensions. And I think once AI gets more embedded across multiple countries in different ways, then I think, again, we move into a 4th dimension where we don't really understand who has the expertise to understand the algorithms, the data, how any of those might have been interfered with by foreign adversaries. I think the complexities and then how much trust to place in AI, I anticipate going forward could be a qualitative change. We're not there right now at all. But your point's very well taken. And I think this goes to what I'm hearing, like this goes to Charlie's point that, there are, the environment is a factor, but really it's what is salient in the changing political context, and Caitlin's initial point about this larger, geopolitical context and multiple actors. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna collect the remaining people I'm listening, starting with, so we'll do Ken's two finger quickly. And then I've got Ron, Eli, and Lauren, you get the last word. Did I forget anyone? Great, we might actually manage time. Okay, so Ken, Ron, Eli, Lauren, in that order.
Recommendation on being clear on what's new.
Yeah.
You've mentioned technologies, a lot of them. And the recommendation that I have is pretty simple. That you take some care in specifying what effects you're anticipating on uncertainty. Uncertainty with respect to response, to detection, uncontrollability or controllability, as we have done in the past in talking about the effects of technologies on uncertainty, command and control, and doctrine. I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Perfect.
Thanks, Ron.
Okay. What emphasis would you place on extremely asymmetric fatality expectations? For instance, does the credibility of U.S. deterrent depend upon whether through counterforce defenses, something else? We could expect 200 million fatalities or 20 million or 2 million.
Okay. Eli?
I had a clarifying question. You, when you said that in the North Korea crisis, North Korea was behaving sort of unpredictably, irrationally, responsibly, was that your characterization, or were you sort of okay? Yeah. So I guess I was wondering, were they actually behaving in a way that was sort of atypical? Because at first blush, when you sort of laid out the timeline, I was sort of like, it looks like they're building credibility. Is it actually different? Is this characteristic of the,
they did it again.
Power that they are?
Lauren?
So you formulate the research question as, are threats meaningful or meaningless? Which I think is a question about how threats correlate with actions. And empirically, you don't speak to that much in the project. It strikes me that the question you're actually answering is, how do elites understand threats, or what are the conditions under which they take them seriously or not? Which I think is a quite valuable contribution. In the NATO case, you essentially present the argument that US and NATO officials saw Russian threats as serious signals of credibility. But of course, NATO also violates many of the red lines that Russia sets out. So I'm wondering if you can speak more to how those calculations are made, what goes into the decision of whether a threat is credible or not, because it's not universally the case that all of these threats are seen as serious signals.
Lisa, now you can answer whatever you want. Pick and choose.
Right.
Don't have to answer everything. Yeah, it's okay.
We're okay.
A couple minutes, yeah.
I'll be
minutes.
brief. Okay, I'll be brief about all of them. I'll try anyway. Ron, could I just ask you for clarification? When you're saying, does the U.S. credibility, so the credibility of the nuclear deterrent, does it depend on casualty counts?
Yes.
And so could you expand on that question a little bit? I want to make sure I understand that I respond appropriately.
Okay, well, Russia does something really bad.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe even uses a nuclear weapon in Ukraine or something.
Mm-hmm.
And they may or may not be deterred by the possibility of a U.S. response. Does the likelihood of their being deterred depend upon what the U.S. could expect to suffer if it made a response? Because various scenarios could lead to wildly different expectations.
So that's right. So I haven't thought about that. I haven't thought about that in these terms for this conflict. So that gives me something to think about, because then it goes to this game of mirrors in terms of, well, what do you think I'm going to do? And what do you think I'm willing to accept as a cost? And so then do you believe my response? So I'll think about that more in this specific context of the Russian threats in 2022. Thank you. In terms of North Korea behaving recklessly, dangerously. So those are the words of the US officials. And this is partly why I think this is important to conduct the interviews, because the way I think we in the room would see it is a rational actor is going to pursue their interests defined as their preferences. And so anything they're doing in pursuit of those interests is rational and has a strategic purpose and an internal logic to it. And so when I observe the North Korean actions, that is what I see. I see this makes sense for a deeply insecure actor with a brand new arsenal that is severely inferior. It makes sense to me that these are the kinds of signals that that leader is sending. Yet everything that I have read in terms of what has been published indicates that US decision makers were not perceiving that. Instead, they were perceiving he is reckless, he is dangerous, he is crazy. It was the irrationality. And so I'm interested in the truth, as best as we can find it, which is our theory, and we're trying to find the capital T truth to how actors behave so that we can understand what we observe in the system. But for this project, I am that animates the project, but then I want to know, when it comes to the practitioners, what are they thinking? And I don't see them thinking that way. I see them thinking differently, and so I expect to see outcomes that track with the way they're perceiving it.
And we'd gotten used to the idea that his father was borderline crazy.
And there are, right, and all the stories, there are so many stories about the things that happen in that regime and the things that personalist leaders do that make them appear crazy to outsiders, even though we know we can track and say each of those myths, each of those eccentricities makes sense for a leader in an insecure situation who is trying to build up a regime based on a cult of personality and based on a small elite win set. And then Lauren, to wrap it up, and thanks all of you for all of these questions and feedback. This is helping me tremendously, so thank you so much. So Lauren, I agree in terms of, and I think it is important to look at how NATO has treated all of these red lines. And I think that it tells me, it has been telling me a lot, because if NATO members felt confident that Russia would absolutely never use nuclear weapons, then I think they would be behaving differently than they are. But also, I think that if NATO members believed Russia is absolutely ready at any moment to do this, I think I would also be observing something very different. So I think they are largely operating in the doubt, in the uncertainty, and in the gray area of, it's more likely than it might have been 25 years ago, but it also doesn't seem terribly likely, except in the moment in the fall when actually maybe it does. So I think it's I take your point very well. That's a great place to look. So thanks to all of you.
Okay, thanks everybody for a great seminar.